The afternoon light came down like honey over the Montana hills, thick and golden and unhurried, the way September light always seems to know it is among the last of its kind before the cold arrives to claim everything. Bunting had been strung between the fence posts. A fiddle was already singing somewhere near the water trough, and the smell of roasted meat drifted across the yard in slow, pleasant waves. The guests of the little ranch had dressed in their finest, which in that part of the territory meant pressed collars and clean boots and hats held with a certain careful pride, and they had come, all of them, to see the new bride. She had arrived by train 3 days prior. That was all most of them knew, and it was enough to fill considerable conversation. A mail-order bride, they said, which was a phrase the town used the way people use a title when they cannot quite decide whether it confers dignity or diminishes it. They said she was from back east somewhere, or perhaps the Midwest. The details shifted depending on who was telling it. They said she was handsome enough, quiet, perhaps a touch serious for a woman on her wedding day. What they did not say, because they had not yet thought to notice, was that she was watching everything. She stood near the edge of the celebration, with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that being overlooked is not always a disadvantage. She held a glass she was not drinking from. Her dress was a muted sage green, practical even in its elegance, chosen, one suspected, with the full understanding that a woman who means to actually live somewhere ought not to arrive in white. She had taken her measure of the yard that morning, walking the property alone before anyone else was properly awake, the dew still on the grass, her eyes moving from the fence line to the barn, to the roof of the main house, reading the ranch the way a careful reader reads a letter written between its lines. She had already made several quiet observations. She kept them to herself. Her new husband stood across the yard, tall and composed, in a way that read to most of the town as confidence, and to her, at 3 days' acquaintance, as something slightly more complicated. He was a man accustomed to being admired. He wore it naturally, the way some men wear good hats. He had greeted every guest with the ease of a man on familiar ground, laughed at the right moments, shaken hands with warmth and authority. He had not looked at her in the last quarter hour. But the fiddle was quickening now, and the guests were beginning to turn, and there was a shape to the afternoon that everyone in attendance understood. The music was gathering itself toward the first dance, and the first dance belonged to the bride and her husband, and the whole of that small Montana town had arranged itself in a loose, expectant circle to watch it happen. The morning had been hers alone. That was the one gift the day had offered before it became a public occasion. One quiet hour, just after the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and before the first wagon came rattling up the road. She had used it the way she used most gifts, practically, without sentiment, and to her own full advantage. She had walked the property from one end to the other. Not wandering, walking. There is a difference, and she was the kind of woman who knew it. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone taking inventory, her eyes level, her attention unhurried. She had arrived with very little the night before, and what she had arrived to, this ranch, this arrangement, this life she had agreed to by letter and sealed by train ticket, she intended to understand before she was expected to perform contentment inside it. The fence line first. She followed it quietly, noting where the posts had heaved and where they had held. The barn she assessed from the outside, reading the slope of its roof, the age of its siding, the way it settled into the ground with the comfortable permanence of something that had been well built once, and mostly left alone since. Then the back of the property. The hen coop sat behind the main house, tucked against a slight rise in the land that must have seemed, to whoever built it, like a sensible windbreak. It had probably served that purpose once. Now the structure leaned slightly to the north, not dramatically, not enough that a person passing quickly would stop and remark on it, but enough. Enough that she stopped. She stood at the entrance and let her eyes adjust to the interior dimness. Dozens of hens went about their business around her feet with the self-important bustle of animals who had never doubted their own importance. She barely noticed them. She was looking at the roof beam. It ran the full length of the coop, just beneath the ridge, a long, heavy timber that had once been sound and was now, she could see it clearly, the soft gray sag of it, the slow surrender, giving way. Not today, perhaps, not by morning. But the beam had been asking the question for some time, and sooner or later the roof would answer it. She stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she filed the observation away in that orderly interior room where she kept things that were true and useful and not yet spoken, turned back toward the house, and went to finish dressing for her wedding. She had not mentioned it to him. She had known him for 3 days. She did not yet know the shape of how he listened, or whether he was the kind of man who heard a practical concern as information or as interference. There were things you learned about a person before you handed them your worries, and she had not yet learned enough. But she had not forgotten it either. The fiddle player had been tuning for the better part of an hour, and when he finally drew his bow across the strings in earnest, the sound lifted over the yard, like something released from a long captivity. The guests turned toward the open ground where couples would dance. Someone clapped. Someone laughed. The afternoon light was still warm, still golden, still doing its best to make everything look like a painting of itself. She stood at the edge of it all, her dress, the good one, the gray-blue wool she had pressed twice on the journey west, catching the last of the September sun. She was composed, as she always was in public, the way a river is composed even when it moves quickly beneath the surface. She watched her husband cross the yard toward her, with that particular walk of his, the one that suggested he was accustomed to arriving at things and finding them arranged to his satisfaction. He extended his hand. It was a courteous gesture. Correct, the kind a man makes when he knows the whole town is watching, and has decided to perform the occasion properly. She recognized the difference between a man offering his hand and a man offering himself, and she did not confuse the two. But she had not come all this way to be ungenerous, and so she was genuinely preparing, to take it. And then she heard it. It was not loud. It would not have reached her through the fiddle and the voices and the general noise of celebration if she had not already known to listen for it. But she had known. Some part of her had been listening for it since that morning, since she had stood in the long shadow of the coop and looked at the gray sag of the beam and filed it away in that quiet interior room. The sound was low and brief and final. A crack, like a question answered. She looked at him. His hand was still extended. His expression was pleasant, expectant, slightly self-satisfied in the way of a man who has arranged a day correctly and expects it to continue. He had not heard it. No one had heard it. The fiddle was bright, and the guests were merry, and the afternoon was doing everything it had been asked to do. She made her decision the way she made most decisions, quickly, and without apology to anyone, including herself. She took a half-step back. Not away from him exactly, simply in a different direction. "Excuse me," she said, low enough that only he could hear, not low enough that he could claim later she had not spoken at all. Then she turned, moved along the side of the house with unhurried purpose, passed through the gate in the board fence, and was gone from the yard entirely. Behind her, the fiddle played on. The guests did not yet notice. Her husband's hand was still in the air. The coop was dim and smelled of dust and old straw, and something underneath both of those things. Something wooden and damp and tired. The smell of a structure that had been asked to stand longer than it had been built to. She pushed the low door open with her shoulder and let her eyes adjust. The beam had not yet fallen, but it would. She could see the split running along its underside, like a sentence written in a language she had learned young, the language of things about to give way. One end had already dropped 2 inches from its bracket. the rusted iron pulling loose from the post, with the slow patience of metal that has quietly made up its mind. The roof above it bowed. The hens below it moved in anxious circles, aware of something wrong in the way that creatures always are, their small bodies pushing against the far wall of the coop in a living tide of feathers and unease. She did not waste time standing there reading the situation. She had already read it. Along the outer wall, beneath a tangle of old rope and a broken harness collar, there was a stack of fence posts, spare lumber that had likely not been touched since the previous owner's time. She selected one, tested its length against her eye, and moved to the center of the coop. She set the post beneath the failing beam at an angle, drove its base into the packed earth with the heel of her boot, 3 hard strikes, and felt the beam stop its slow descent and hold. It was not elegant, it was not permanent, but it would stand through the afternoon and through the night, and long enough to be done properly. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow and began moving the hens. This was the work that took patience, not the beam, not the post, not the calculation of angles and weight, but the hens themselves, who were frightened and did not understand that she was helping, and said so loudly. She gathered them in armfuls, 2 and 3 at a time, warm and indignant, and moved them through the side door into the adjoining yard, where the ground was solid and the sky was open, and nothing was about to fall on them. She did not rush. She spoke to them in a low, even tone that was not quite words and not quite music, but something in between, the kind of sound that means, "You are safe now, settle." She was nearly finished when she noticed it. A single white feather, drifting down from somewhere in the dusty air above her, turning slowly on nothing at all, the way feathers do. It landed on the brim of her hat and stayed there. She did not take it off. She did not brush it away. She simply looked at it for a moment. That small, weightless, ridiculous thing, and something moved through her expression that was not quite a smile, but was closely related to one. Then she turned back to the hens. She heard them before she saw them. Voices first, the bright, carrying kind that belong to people who have had a glass of something celebratory and are looking for something worth remarking on. Then footsteps on the dry ground, the particular crunch of boots that are dressed for a party and wandering somewhere they had not planned to go. She did not turn around immediately. She was setting the last of the hens down in the outer yard, smoothing the feathers along one particularly aggrieved bird's back with a steady hand, and she saw no reason to hurry on account of visitors. They came around the corner of the coop in a loose cluster, 4 of them, perhaps 5, and they stopped when they saw her. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then someone laughed. Not unkindly, exactly, but not kindly either. The sort of laugh that is looking for company, and finds it quickly. The others joined, and the sound spread the way such sounds do, easy and self-satisfied, filling the space where courtesy might otherwise have stood. She straightened, brushed a slow hand down the front of her dress, which was past saving for the afternoon, and she knew it. Her sleeves were still rolled to the elbow. Her hands were the color of honest work. The feather was still on her hat. She looked at them with an expression that gave nothing away, not embarrassment, not defiance, not explanation. She simply looked, the way a woman looks at weather she has already accounted for. "The Coop Bride," someone said. She could not have told afterward which voice it was. It didn't especially matter. The name landed in the dust between them, and she watched it land, and she did not pick it up. He arrived last. She knew it was him by the way the laughter shifted, not stopping, but reorganizing itself around a new center, a little more careful now, a little more aware of itself. She turned, and there he was, standing just at the edge of the group, and his face said everything that his silence did not. Mortification is a specific thing. It is different from anger, different from surprise, different even from disappointment. It sits behind the eyes, and tightens the jaw, and makes a man very still, in the way that means he is working hard to stay composed. She had seen it before on other faces. She recognized it clearly on his. He looked at her dress, her hands, the feather. The hens settled peacefully in the afternoon light, and she understood in that moment something she had only suspected before. She had learned a great deal about this man from the ranch, from the house, from the state of the coop's neglected roof, but this was the clearest lesson yet. He cared, profoundly and above almost everything else, about what people thought of him. She had married a man whose deepest fear was looking foolish, and she had just, on the afternoon of their wedding, handed the whole town exactly that. She did not wait for him to speak first. She did not offer an explanation, or an apology, or even a glance that asked for either. She simply moved past the edge of the gathered guests with the same unhurried step she had used all morning, smoothed her skirts with dusty hands, and accepted a cup of water from the table near the fence, as though nothing about the afternoon had been unusual. He did not follow her. He stood where he was for a moment longer, and then turned back toward the guests, and the conversation resumed around him the way water resumes after a stone is dropped, closing over, but not forgetting the disturbance. The nickname arrived in town before the week was out. The Coop Bride. It traveled the way small-town words always travel, not announced, not malicious in any organized way, but passed along at the general store, mentioned near the post office, repeated at the church steps with a certain fond cruelty that such communities reserve for stories that confirm what they already believed. That a mail-order bride was an uncertain proposition, that a woman who came from elsewhere might not understand how things were done, that the Dawson Ranch had gotten itself something it had not quite bargained for. She heard it the first time on a Tuesday, from the way a woman at the dry goods counter stopped talking when she walked in. She heard it the second time in plain words from a man who thought himself too far away to be heard. She noted both occasions the same way she noted the weather, as information, accurate or otherwise, about conditions she would be living in. He, for his part, said nothing to her about it. This was not silence of the forgetting kind. It was the silence of a man who had decided that if a thing were not spoken, it need not be reckoned with. He was courteous. He was present at the table. He passed things when asked and answered when spoken to. But the warmth that might have been, the tentative, careful warmth that a new marriage sometimes finds in its first quiet weeks, did not come. He went about his mornings. She went about hers. And her mornings, without exception, began at the coop. She was there before the light fully settled, moving through the routine she had already made her own. Feed, water, inspection of the boards she had braced, a check of the laying boxes, a quiet accounting of what was whole and what needed attention. The hens had sorted themselves into a familiar order now. She knew their habits without having named them. The white feather remained in her hatband. She had not placed it there as a statement. She had placed it there because it had been in her hand that afternoon, and the hat had been nearby, and it had stayed because she had not removed it. But it stayed. Every morning, the feather, the hat, the coop, the quiet work. She did not explain herself, not once, not to him, not to the town, not to anyone who looked at her with that particular slant of curiosity that was almost a question. There was nothing, she had decided, that required her explanation. October came in, like a door closing. Not slowly, not with the gradual amber courtesy of most Montana autumns, but firmly, one morning cold, where the evening before had still been warm enough to sit outside without a coat. The hills went gold and then brown, and then something harsher, a pale, exhausted gray, and the sky pulled low and stayed there. The cattle shifted in their grazing, restless in the way animals are when they understand something the people around them have not yet named. He understood it too, though he would not have said so aloud. The first sign was the price report that came in with the supply wagon on the second Tuesday of October, a sheet of figures from the county trading office that he read once, folded carefully, and placed in the inside breast pocket of his coat, where it remained for 3 days before he took it out and read it again. Cattle prices had dropped, not gently. The eastern markets were soft, the buyer networks unreliable, and a glut of stock from the southern ranges had compressed what any ranching man in this part of Montana could reasonably expect to earn before the year's end. The numbers were not catastrophic on paper. They were simply not what he had planned around. And a ranch, like any living thing, does not operate on what was almost enough. The supply routes were the next difficulty. A bridge south of town had weakened in an early rain, and the wagons that came through twice a month began arriving late, then incomplete, then not at all for a stretch of 11 days. What could be ordered could not always be delivered. What could be delivered cost more than it had in September. He made adjustments without announcing them. He said nothing to her, nothing to his hands, nothing to anyone in town who might take the information and carry it where pride could not follow. He was accustomed to solving things quietly. He had always believed that a man's difficulties were his own to carry until they were resolved, and that speaking them aloud before they were resolved was a kind of surrender. The frost came in the 3rd week of October, 2 full weeks ahead of any winter he could remember. It settled overnight without warning, and by morning, the water trough near the barn had a thin skin of ice across it, and the pasture grasses were pale and stiff in a way that said they would not recover. He stood at the fence line that morning and looked at what the cold had done to the ground, and understood, with the quiet clarity that only comes when a man allows himself to look directly at a thing, that this winter was going to ask more of him than the last several winters combined. He had cattle, he had land, he had debt that he managed, carefully, at the edge of what the land could sustain. What he did not have, though he had not yet calculated how much he did not have it, was a reliable source of income to carry him through what was coming. While he stood at the fence line running numbers in his head that refused to come out favorably, she was already 3 steps ahead of a problem he had not yet fully named. She had seen the winter coming the way a practical woman sees most things, not through prophecy, but through attention. The grasses had been thinning since mid-September. The mornings had carried a particular sharpness, a quality of air that was clean in the way that cold things are clean, and she had read it plainly. She had said nothing about it to him. There was no invitation for that conversation, and she was not a woman who offered her observations where they were not wanted. Instead, she had worked. Through October, quietly and without announcement, she had expanded the flock. She had traded mending work, shirts for the blacksmith's family, a coat hem for the minister's wife, a set of curtains for the boarding house, in exchange for extra feed grain, enough to see the hens through the lean months when the ground would offer them nothing. She had reinforced the coop herself, sealing gaps in the boards with salvaged wood she found behind the barn, and packing straw along the interior walls against the cold. The work was not glamorous. Her hands showed it. She did not mind. The hens responded the way well-kept things respond to care. They laid steadily, even as the frost deepened and the mornings turned gray and reluctant. Not every hen, not every day, but enough. Enough, she had calculated, to matter. She began bringing eggs to the town market on Thursdays, rising before first light to pack them carefully in straw-lined crates and carry them in on the wagon she had learned to handle without assistance. She did not announce this to him. She did not present it as a solution or a gesture or a point in any argument. She simply went and came back and set whatever coin she received in a tin on the kitchen shelf without ceremony. The first Thursday, she came back with enough to cover the cost of the week's flour and lamp oil, with something left besides. The second Thursday, a little more. The town women who bought from her did not call her the coop bride to her face. They were not unkind, most of them, only cautious. as small-town people are cautious around a story they have already decided the ending of. She sold to them with even courtesy, and asked nothing more than a fair price, and they paid it, because the eggs were fresh, and the winter was making everything else scarce. She wore her everyday hat to market. In its brim, tucked just so, was a single white feather from one of the hens, small, slightly curved, unremarkable to anyone who did not know it was there. She knew it was there. That was sufficient. Meanwhile, in the house, he sat with his ledgers, and the frost pressed closer against the windows, and the numbers continued their quiet, relentless work against him. The third Thursday, she came back with enough to settle the outstanding account at the feed store, a bill he had not mentioned to her, but which she had read, upside down, from across the kitchen table the week before, because she was the kind of woman who noticed things and filed them away without comment. She set the tin on the shelf as she always did, and said nothing about the feed store, and he said nothing about the tin. That was the arrangement, unspoken and apparently sufficient for both of them. By the fourth week, the other market vendors had begun to take notice, not of her, precisely, of the table, of the way women stopped there first, before moving on to the dried goods, the salted meat, the root vegetables that were beginning to show the hard use of a long winter. Fresh eggs in January were not a small thing. They were, in the vocabulary of that season, a kind of small miracle, and people will pay for miracles at nearly any price when the cold has gone on long enough. She did not raise her prices. That was the thing the town would quietly remember later, though no one said so at the time. She kept them steady and fair, and she smiled at each woman who approached. Not warmly, exactly, because she was not a woman given to performed warmth, but evenly, as one capable person regards another capable person, without judgment, without triumph. There were one or two among them who had laughed loudest at the wedding. She knew which ones they were. She had a memory for faces and a talent for stillness, and she simply served them as she served everyone else, counted their coins, wrapped their eggs in the paper she brought folded in her basket, and wished them a good morning. If they felt the weight of that courtesy, the particular, quiet dignity of being forgiven something by someone who has not technically forgiven you, that was between them and their own consciences. The feather in her hat brim caught the winter light, each week the same way. A small, pale curve, barely visible, meaning nothing to anyone who had not made it mean something themselves. No one asked about it. No one looked long enough. Inside the ranch house, the ledger on his desk told its slow, cold story. The cattle numbers were what they were. The supply routes remained frozen. The larger world of commerce and credit had not shifted in anyone's favor that season. But the tin on the kitchen shelf grew heavier each Thursday, coin by quiet coin, and even he, proud and silent as he remained, had begun to glance at it when he passed. He had not yet looked at it long, but he was beginning to. It was the ledger that finally made him stop. He had been keeping the books the way a man keeps a wound, checking on it often enough to confirm it had not healed, never long enough to understand why. Numbers had a way of speaking plainly when a man had no more arguments left to make against them, and for weeks he had been finding ways to argue. The cattle prices would recover, the routes would open, the season would turn. These were the things a proud man told himself when the evidence had stopped cooperating. But one evening in late January, he sat down at the desk with his pen and his ledger and his habitual sense of bracing for the worst, and the worst did not arrive. The column he expected to see dropping had, instead, held still. He checked the figures twice, then a third time, the lamp throwing yellow light across the page, while the cold pressed in around the windows, and the house settled into its quiet. He had not done anything different. He sat for a while with that thought. It was past midnight when he rose and moved toward the kitchen for no particular reason. Habit, restlessness, the vague human need to stand in a different room when one's thoughts have become uncomfortable. The lamp on the kitchen table had been turned down low, but not extinguished, and beside it sat a small notebook he had not noticed before. It was hers. He recognized it only by its plainness, by the fact that nothing on the ranch was that orderly unless she had touched it. He should not have opened it. He opened it. The handwriting was careful and unhurried, the columns ruled by hand with a straight edge. Dates down the left margin, quantities across, prices noted with a precision that had no room for guessing. She had been recording every egg sold, every hen preserved, every Thursday's take, since October. She had noted the market rates, tracked the fluctuations, adjusted the quantities she brought, based on what the previous week had sold and what the town seemed to need. It was not a simple tally. It was management, quiet, patient, unannounced management. He turned to the earliest pages. She had begun the notebook before the first frost, before anyone could have known how bad the winter would be. She had simply looked at the coop roof in September, calculated what could be saved, and begun. He sat down in the cold kitchen, with the notebook open in his hands, and did not move for a long time. The tin on the shelf caught a little of the lamplight. Heavy and still. Outside, the January dark was absolute. Inside, something in the ledger of his own thinking had stopped dropping, and was, slowly and with great reluctance, beginning to reckon. He set the notebook back on the table, exactly as he had found it. He did not sleep well that night, and in the gray hour before the ranch fully woke, he rose, pulled on his coat, and walked out into the cold. Not toward the barn, not toward the frozen fields where the cattle stood clustered and waiting for a relief that had not yet come. He walked around the side of the main house, past the bare kitchen garden, toward the coop. She was already there. She moved through the morning with the unhurried efficiency he had come to recognize without meaning to study. The lamp hung from its hook near the door, throwing a warm circle of light over the straw and the roosts, and she worked within it, calm and methodical, the hens settling around her feet, as though her presence were simply a feature of their world, something fixed and reliable that required no explanation. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not look up immediately. She knew he was there. He had no doubt about that. But she did not rush to acknowledge him, and she did not stop her work to wait on whatever he had come to say. She simply continued, steady and unhurried, and the quiet between them held its shape without breaking. He looked around the coop. He saw the repaired beam above, the clean straw, the feed organized along the near wall, the water vessels checked and refilled, despite the cold that made such things twice the labor. He saw months of unannounced work, laid out in the plain language of good order. He reached down and picked up the feed pail that sat near the door. She glanced at him then, just once, a brief, clear look, measuring nothing, demanding nothing, simply acknowledging that he was there and had made a choice. Then she returned to her work. He moved to the far side of the coop and began. They did not speak. There was, perhaps, nothing yet that could be said with the right words, and both of them seemed to understand that. The silence between them was not cold. It was the kind of quiet that forms when two people are paying attention to the same thing at the same time, and find, somewhere inside that shared attention, a kind of steadiness they had not had access to before. The narrator, who had been watching this woman since September with something like fond admiration, noted simply, "Some understandings between two people do not arrive in speeches or apologies or carefully arranged words. They arrive in the willingness to show up in the cold and pick up the pail and stand beside someone and work." Outside, the January light was beginning, pale and thin, over the Montana hills. Spring came to Montana the way it always does after a hard winter, slowly, and then all at once. The frozen creek thawed by degrees. The hills greened from the bottom up, and the town of people who had spent months hauling wood and counting their stores emerged into the April light with the particular gratitude of those who had not been entirely certain they would. The spring market opened on a Friday. Tables set out along the main thoroughfare, wagons lined the far side of the road, and the whole town gathered with the eager, slightly dazed quality of people, remembering what it felt like to be warm. She arrived with her wagon, her crates, and her white feathered hat. He arrived beside her. He had not prepared remarks. He was not the sort of man who prepared remarks. But he had spent the January mornings in the coupe beside her, and the February evenings watching the ledger numbers turn, and the March weeks carrying egg crates to the wagon without being asked. And somewhere in the accumulation of all of that, something in him had quietly and completely rearranged itself. He waited until there were enough people gathered at their table, neighbors, acquaintances, the woman from the dry goods store who had coined the nickname in the first place, and then he spoke, plainly, without ceremony, in the same voice he used for every serious thing. He said that his wife had saved the ranch. He said that she had seen what needed doing on the first morning she ever walked the property, and she had done it, and that he had been too proud and too foolish to understand what that meant, until the winter showed him exactly what it meant. He said that he owed her more than he knew how to calculate, and that he intended to spend some considerable time figuring it out. There was a silence across the gathered market. Then he turned to her and asked, quietly, if she would dance with him. She looked at him for a moment. Around them, the town held its breath in the pleasant, collective way of people witnessing something they will describe to others for years. She reached up and pressed the white feather more firmly into the brim of her hat. A small, private motion, a joke only she had ever been in on, and perhaps now, finally, he was beginning to understand the punchline. Then she took his hand. There was no fiddle. There was only the spring air and the open market yard, and two people finding, after a long and instructive winter, the rhythm they had been working toward since September. The town watched, and from that day forward, no one in that part of Montana called her the Coupe Bride. They called her, simply, the woman who held everything together, which, of course, she always had been.